Again, for those of you who've never met me before, my name is Kimmo Forss. I work as a Microsoft Consulting Services meteorologist focusing on the cloud. So I used to be an architect, but that was for on-premises. But when you're doing with cloud, you're it's hard to architect cloud, right? So you're just giving forecasts on how deployments will go and whatnot. So been doing SharePoint for a long time. And one of my focus areas is actually content migration, so moving stuff into SharePoint. And actually, before SharePoint, I did the same thing, but against a Lotus Domino environment. So been trapped in that realm for many moons. So what I wanted to talk about today is actually when you're doing a content migration exercise, there are certain things that you should do before you do that, before you actually start on engagement. The first one is actually trying to figure out what you have. So assessing your on-premises content so that you realize then what should you bring with you, what should you leave behind. How many of you have moved in the last, let's say, 5 years to a new apartment? Did you move to a bigger apartment? Hands up. Smaller apartment? So again, I always try to use the analogies of moving when I talk about content migration, because actually you actually see a lot of commonalities between human behavior and customer behavior with regards to content migration. So we moved 5 years ago, and so when we were sort of cleaning up all the mess from the old place, so we found on the attic, I found 5 boxes of old C cassette tapes. So then my first initial gut reaction was, well, I'll get rid of those. But then I made the mistake of opening one of those boxes, and you go, oh, actually, I like that band. And then you go like, oh, I might want to listen to that one. So I'm still pretty proud of myself because I was able to get rid of 2 of those 5 boxes. Then we moved. Guess where those boxes are now? Up in the attic in the new place. So again, how likely is it that I want to listen to that band, go up to the attic, try to find that bloody cassette tape and say, and do I have a cassette tape player anymore? No. Why didn't I get rid of them? Because we're a creature of habit. Like, you get the feeling, I might need that sometimes. And that's one of the worst enemies when you start to look at content migration, because unless you do a proper assessment and figuring out what you have, and actually do a rational discussion, okay, what do I really need in the new environment? You will end up moving, or you'll end up in a project where you're moving old junk into the new environment. And unfortunately, oftentimes that's the case that happens. Then the argument is that I don't have the time now to do the cleanup. I'll do the cleanup later. Again, later never happens. So we'll talk a bit about the content assessment part. I'll also touch upon application assessment part, because again, if you have built applications on a platform that you want to decommission, you need to have a strategy about how to deal with them. So will you keep the environment around until the applications are sort of past their best before date, or will you actually do an application migration approach as well? And then we'll talk about migration planning with regards to moving content from SharePoint to SharePoint, and also from other sources to SharePoint. And tomorrow we'll talk about moving content to the cloud. So again, I always start my migration sessions with this quote from Sun Tzu. And the reason why this is so important with migrations is, first of all, like to a business crowd, they just love quotes from Sun Tzu. But it is really important, because if you think of it, so for those of you who moved to a bigger place, so you probably needed more furniture, right? Because the old place and the new place weren't exactly the same. So again, if you're moving to a smaller place, you probably need to get rid of some furniture, and then you have a really big challenge. Where do I put the Kinect? Which room is big enough for the Kinect, right? So you have to know the capabilities of your old environment and your new environment. If you know both, then you're actually in a very good state. If you know one but not the other, the chances are 50-50. If you know neither, how likely is it that project will succeed? It's not very likely. And unfortunately, it's oftentimes really, really hard to know what you have. So I've had discussions with customers who say that we have a petabyte of data. And I go, no, you don't. They go, yes, we do. I go, no, you don't. Yes, we do. And it's really hard to have a rational, facts-based discussion because it's oftentimes almost impossible to do a proper inventory of all that you have. Because let's think, for instance, about file shares. So you may have customers who are using replicating file shares. So actually you have, how many replicas do you have of your content? The same applies for Lotus Domino. So you usually, if you ask a Domino admin, you'll get the answer that we have, let's say, 1,400 databases which consume 5 terabytes of data. But how much of that data are replicas? So how much unique data do we have? So again, knowing what you have, knowing where you're going is really, really key. So the challenge is, again, so how do you identify what you have? So figuring out where is it stored. So again, if it's SharePoint, it's kind of simple, right? It's in SharePoint, but where in SharePoint? What data, like who owns the data? Is it still relevant? So another example, when I was younger, so many, many years ago, so I was working in a steel mill in the research department. So I had a meeting with the chief scientist, and actually his assistant came in, and she said, oh, I have this folder of old lab test results. What do you want to do with them? So he told her, give me the folders. He took it, looked through it, and gave it back and said, well, get rid of it. And when she was turning away, walking out, but make copies of them first. Again, the human nature, I might need it sometime. So again, is it still relevant is a really, really key thing, but it's really, really hard to figure that out. Because again, do you have the time or the luxury to go through all of your content? No. So what should you do then? Well, it's a tough one. The good thing is with technology today, if we consider, for instance, SharePoint, the fact is that you can actually define content lifecycle management in using the product. So you should actually have expiration dates for documents. So once you have that, then the system starts to maintain itself, and the next time you'll do a migration, you know that you only have relevant data left. The ownership thing is also in SharePoint. You could find the ownership by just looking at who modified the document, and you could technically send a mail to have an application that would traverse through the entire environment and send mails that, is this document still relevant? Is this document still relevant? You wouldn't get a good answer. So again, identifying what you have is really, really key. For if you're moving data from other content sources like file shares or public folders, document and whatnot, you also need to know, are there artifacts in those content sources that are not suitable for SharePoint? So I had a customer, this was SharePoint 2007, who wanted to decommission all of their file shares and move all the content into SharePoint. So, and they complained that our databases become huge and it's so slow. Then we looked at the things that they were putting into SharePoint. So they took literally everything. So they had SQL files, so MDF and LDF files, storing them in SharePoint. They had God knows what. Again, because they believed a Microsoft salesperson who said that file shares are history, just move everything to SharePoint, right? Again, trying to figure out, do you have things that shouldn't go to SharePoint? Do you have things that are too big for SharePoint? So your video libraries. So should you put them in SharePoint or should you just expose them via SharePoint? So having a rational way to sort of do that assessment is key. And the final part, especially with Domino environments or with replicating file shares, do we have duplicates? So again, there's no point of moving duplicates into SharePoint, right? Because the whole idea is actually, rather than distributing content out, having multiple versions, we should actually have just one master version. So, but again, do we have tools to do this today? Unfortunately, not really. So you could arguably say that, well, for file shares, actually, you could do a dir and pipe it into a file and do something clever based on that. But we don't really have good assessment tools for that. So that's one challenge. And then, if you wanted to create a tool like that, so what should you look for? So this is an approach that we've used within MCS quite successfully for customers when we want to have a rational discussion on the sizes of your content volumes. So we actually start by doing an assessment that, in a way, kind of similar to a search engine that would crawl through those content sources and sort of pick up the relevant metadata. And by relevant, I mean things like file extensions, file types, the sizes of the data, ages of data. And our approach has been that we actually treat the different content sources alike. So at the end of the day, we don't care about the content of the file in an assessment like this. We care about the size, the age, and whatnot. So if we can do an assessment like this, let's say that we would point a content harvester against a file share, a public folder, a SharePoint environment, and then have a rational and put them into a data warehouse, and then we could start to do pivoting, for instance, and see that, well, if we decide to only move data that's, let's say, no older than 6 months, our data volume from a petabyte goes down to X gigabytes. So again, having a rational way to have this discussion, because the problem is, if you don't have facts, it becomes an emotional discussion that I might need that. So another thing that happened when we were moving, so when you go to enough Microsoft conferences, you actually start to realize that your wardrobe is filled with conference t-shirts. So I'll let you in on a secret. You keep a Microsoft conference t-shirt in a dark cupboard a long time, they'll shrink. It happened to mine, I don't know what. So then you go, okay, so you're moving, you take this like TechEd AD like 500, the TechEd 85, blah, blah, blah. So you have a pile of old t-shirts. So what do you do with them? Again, what you should do is get rid of them. But then, oh, this is actually a pretty cool t-shirt. I was with Bob and we did this and that when I had them. So again, having a way that you actually do a rational discussion so that you can get rid of the stuff that you don't need and just move what you need. So that kind of ties then, once you know what you have, you should then figure out the right activities for the different types of content. So should I move it? So again, for my cassette tapes or my t-shirt, should I keep them? Should I get rid of them? For content, the same thing. Should I delete it? If it's old data, do I really need it? Should I move it? Where should I move it? Should I move it to an on-premises environment? Should I consider actually moving them to the cloud? Or should I just put them on long-term storage and archive them so that then if for some reason in the future I would need them, I would get access to them? Again, many of these decisions aren't technical in nature, but we need the technical facts actually to support us in that discussion. Because otherwise you go, oh, again, I have a petabyte of data. You don't. So then, content in a way is typically easier because content is usually just data. Applications tend to be much, much harder to figure out what to do. So I usually use this model where I look at one way dimension of applications which are kind of a data-driven applications and the other one which are more process-driven. And so as an example for a data-driven application would be like access databases where you have tables of data, you have forms for entering the data or viewing the data, you have lists for displaying data from tables, and then you have like the process-based ones which are typically always unique. You have different levels of integrations with different systems. You may need to integrate with your payroll system or with your HR system. You might have workflows that actually move entities between environments. And oftentimes you have a bunch of custom code there that's actually not something that you can just take from one environment and drop it into the SharePoint environment. So that's one way of slicing and dicing your application inventory. And the other way of looking at this is then, so for applications, are they completely custom? So meaning that you've built something from scratch. Or are they out-of-the-box type of functionality or template-based functionalities? And by templates, I would mean here, for instance, a contacts list in a public folder in Exchange, or a documents database in Domino. So if you do an inventory of our applications and kind of remember this, and then obviously the complexity, the more you go up to the top right quadrant, the more expensive it becomes. So again, if you're moving, let's say, data from an Excel spreadsheet into SharePoint, it's just data in a table. If you're moving and trying to rewrite an SAP application and move that to SharePoint, it's a complex thing. So again, my advice when you're considering about migration to the cloud or even to a new environment is remember this, and kind of if you have an application inventory, try to say that into which quadrant does it fall, because that actually then helps you when you're scoping your migration. So, by the way, if there's any questions, just call out, because I'm not a big fan of waiting to the end of the session, because I know that if I'm in the audience, I usually forget my question. So, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I've actually got two. So, what about, obviously we want to delete as much content that we're not using as possible, but then with some global organizations, larger organizations, you have certain retention policies.
Yes.
For legal reasons, these documents. What are your suggestions for how you manage them in terms of archiving?
Yeah, so we actually had that case with one of our customers. So they started using SharePoint Portal Server 2001. So they used that for document management. So then when SharePoint 2003 came out, we said, well, you should upgrade. They said, no, we can't, because the functionality was not, it didn't have the same levels of functionality in 2003. So then when 2007 came along, actually it had the same level of functionality. So then we went back to the customer and had a discussion, and actually we proposed them a content assessment exercise where they would actually get rid of old stuff. But they said, well, we can't get rid of anything. I said, why? Well, because we actually store, it was a company who did management work on a nuclear power plant. So all the reports and all that documentation were in the SharePoint Portal Server 2001 database. So they had to keep everything. They had to have the audit trails going back to whenever someone actually did something in that environment. So in scenarios where you have local business requirements that actually mandate you to keep the data, then that's a given. You just have to live with that. The challenge will then be is if the old system has functionalities that are not available on the new platform. So how to mitigate that? And the way that I usually approach that is by looking at, well, what type of application again? So kind of this, so is it a data-driven? So if it's a data-driven application, then what we care about is making sure that we keep all the data. If it's an application, sort of business logic-based one, that becomes a bit more tricky. And usually when I'm in a situation where a customer asks about an application migration, I usually, if we have the luxury of being able to change the application. So I usually start that discussion by saying, well, this application that we're talking about, when was it created? So probably if it was an old application, the best thing to ask is, well, have the business requirements changed since? And more often than not, they have. And if that's the case, so then why should you build an application today to meet the business requirements from 10 years ago? So actually, if you're a good salesman, you can actually use that as an advantage to say that this actually gives you an opportunity to rewrite the applications to meet your current business requirements, not the yesterday's ones. But again, those discussions are always case by case. But again, the best advice I would say is try to get rid of the old stuff. Again, don't move the cassette tapes from one attic to another attic. But if you have to, just be rational about it. And then also another way of having this discussion, it boils down to the question, so who's driving the content migration project? Is it an IT-driven or is it a business-driven? If it's IT-driven, then you're in a big heap of trouble because business will say, I need everything. So then the right answer to that question is for IT to say to each business unit, so, okay, so you own, let's say, this web application, then you should cover the costs of migrating that. Because actually bringing money into that discussion is a good way to actually examine how important that content really is. So if business owns it, but they are not prepared to pay for it, then is it really mission critical? All right? So again, you'll see the same diagram for all this. So I still keep the SharePoint 2003 slide here because we still have customers on older technologies. So even though we at Microsoft kind of naively hope that customers will immediately, when we launch a new product, that they will immediately upgrade, that won't happen. And for many reasons, right? And I'm actually a strong advocate of the principle that if there's no business gain in upgrading, why should you? Which my salespeople hate me for saying that, but actually, in reality, like, you shouldn't upgrade just for the fun of upgrading, right? Because upgrades are never fun. Content migration is even less fun. So anyway, so again, if you're moving from a SharePoint environment, the things that usually from 2003, the things that usually move really, really easy are lists, because at the end of the day, if you remember, a list in 2003 is a list in 2007, is a list in 2010. The challenge is there's no Microsoft product for moving data from SharePoint 2003 directly to 2010. So if you want to use it using Microsoft supported or out-of-the-box approaches, you would have to then first upgrade your 2003 to 2007 and then to 2010. Medium effort, simple customizations, and also the fact that in 2003 we didn't have content types. So we usually had customers who had a stronger information architecture, had created list templates. So the thing that you should do is actually do a mapping between your list templates to the corresponding content types. And also URLs, again, because you're moving between different environments, your URLs will probably change. So you may need to consider about having a link fix-up strategy. And again, the link fix-up is another area where you usually have the first reaction from the customers are like, we cannot allow any link to break. Everything has to work. And it's actually really, really hard to do. So the only way of guaranteeing that that wouldn't happen is doing in-place upgrades where you're keeping the same web application names and whatnot. And in reality, that's the worst way of doing upgrades in SharePoint. So URLs, my advice there is, again, make sure that you educate, you have a communication plan to your end users that we are moving to the new environment. You may see that some of your old links won't work anymore because they're pointing to the old environment. Yes?
Are there any tools that would scan through the content database and pick out URLs like that?
So there are tools that so in SharePoint, the SharePoint object model is really rich for doing that. So there are migration tools that actually does link fix-ups for you. And there's also approaches that you could have something kind of in front of SharePoint once you sort of upgraded. So you would have, this was the old URL, this is the new URL. So if the request comes in here, it knows to automatically translate those. Also, this depends very much on in newer versions of SharePoint, if you're using the publishing capabilities, we usually store relative URLs. Whereas if you're using Foundation or WSS 3.0 functionality, it's typically full URLs. So again, if you have the luxury of making sure that you actually are using relative URLs, the pain is less. Some other things, which is really, really a sizable effort, is if you have custom site definitions. Because my recommendation with custom site definitions is actually try to not upgrade them as such, just create new sites using the out-of-the-box site definitions and just move the content. And I'll show you a demo on how you could do that. Another thing which is a sizable effort is if you need to rearrange structure. So let's say that you for some reason have had an information architecture where you were creating site collections for everything. And then you realize that you have a large number of site collections, and if you have a business need to aggregate information, having multiple site collections means that the only way of doing that is actually by using search. Again, search has its challenge because you cannot guarantee the freshness of your indexes. So there might be cases where you actually want to take site collections and actually demote them into subsites. So again, those would fall into the sizable effort. And then if you need to do coexistence, if you have a customer that says, we need to make sure that we can do coexistence, in a way, it's a good thing because your consulting revenue would just go up because it's so much more complex to achieve. Because you need to make sure that you can then have the environment so that the end use, because with coexistence, the biggest challenge will be, what if you have people editing the same content in two different places at the same time? So again, coexistence, I would rather have an approach where we will say that we will do a migration, a site collection at a time, and when we start the migration of this site collection, we'll mark it as read-only so that people can view the information, but then they can't edit that until the information is in a new environment. So then moving from 2007 or 2010, again, list libraries, pretty trivial. Simple customizations, again, we are pretty sort of version friendly going to a newer version. So for instance, we don't deprecate APIs when we go to the next version. So those APIs will always be around at least like n-1. Will they work in the same way? Maybe, maybe not, but they will still compile. Again, the same challenge. So if we want to move from, if we for some reason created custom site definitions, again, moving those artifacts into a new environment will still be a challenging thing. So again, with 2010, there shouldn't be any reason anymore for anyone to create custom site definitions because we can achieve exactly the same goal using web templates. So as you see, like and honestly, the most migration scenarios that I see today are usually from 2007 to 2010. And why do I call them migrations rather than upgrades? Because for me, if you're moving an environment to another environment, I'm migrating, right? So the fact that we actually upgrade the database is irrelevant. I just consider upgrade as a special version of migration. So the biggest sort of the biggest number of engagements that I'm currently working with regards to migrations are moving from customized 2007 environments to a more out-of-the-box 2010 environment. So which is not always that trivial because, again, even though branding artifacts typically work well, but then your features and your feature definitions may not actually be written in a way that actually supports a full upgrade. Any questions on this? So again, as I said, moving SharePoint content, there's multiple ways of doing this. So there's the ways that I'm mentioning here are things that you can do out of the box. But again, these are then version specific. So if you have, let's say, a 2007 environment, so what are the ways that you can move content between web applications or between web or environments? And the same thing for 2010. So the things I already mentioned, the caveats, the URLs will change. So if you're taking data from one SharePoint farm into another SharePoint farm, the URLs for all the artifacts will change. So typically, that's a problem for people who are sending a lot of emails with links to documents, or if you have alerts that are sent as email, because then people will click on the link in their Outlook, and then they will be pointed to the old environment. Some other things that you should consider when you're moving between environments is making sure that you have matching quota templates, because so when you're creating a site collection in SharePoint, you can assign a quota template to it. So, and when you look in SharePoint, the quota you see that this has, let's say, the team quota template. But actually what is stored behind the scenes is not the name of the template, it's just the identifier. So it may be that in your source environment, your quota template for a team site has the ID of 1, and in the target environment, the same quota template may have the ID of 4. So, but that's an easy fix. You just have to, in a way, enumerate through these and see which one, and just reapply the templates. So that's one thing that you should thing. And then, but the bigger one is if you have dependencies on deployed solutions. So again, if you're, let's say, moving a content database from one web application or from one environment to another environment, and you have deployed customizations in your environment which are then activated in those site collections, then your site collections will have references to feature IDs that may or may not exist in the future environment. So again, as a part of your content assessment for SharePoint, you should look at the types of content, the age of content, but you should also look at the site collections and seeing which features are enabled in the site collections and also in the subsites. And that's actually a really important exercise also if you're considering moving to the cloud, because again, the feature sets or the capabilities in the cloud are not the same as on premises. So you need to make sure that, for instance, if you're moving a site, if you would want to move a site collection from one environment to the other one, if you have a custom web part that's deployed in Farm 1, you actually will fail in a new environment because those features won't exist. And that's, again, this is what we usually see as a big blocker in upgrades. So, for instance, one of the things that we do for our SharePoint Online customers in the dedicated space, we actually have a process for analyzing their customizations so that we know that we will try to minimize the risks for an upgrade. The irony here is that we do that for our customers, we did not do it for ourselves. So we ended up in a situation when we were upgrading our environment to 2010, we were blocked because we were using a third-party customization that didn't have an upgrade path. So again, do as we say, not as we do, right? So for large volumes, again, moving data between environments, database, detach, and attach is your friend because that's the most efficient way of moving data between two web applications or between two SharePoint environments. And because that will retain full fidelity because it'll take the SQL database because all the content is stored in that database. So it is by far the best way. So the main thing here, again, is the last bullet point here. So if you have dependencies and your content database has references to those customization artifacts, you need to make sure that the new environment has the same artifacts as well. So it is by far the most efficient way of doing things. However, it may not always be available to you because, again, let's say that if you, for some reason, if your SharePoint environment is outsourced and it's another team that actually manages your SQL environment, then you need to make sure that you can get that database from your SQL team and then that they will actually give you. So the process will be that once you sort of identified the database, you'll just take a database backup, move that to the new environment, restore the backup, and attach the database. It actually does a lot of good things at the same time because it actually goes and scans through the environment to make sure that there's no orphan sites or whatnot. So this is the best way of moving things. So actually for SharePoint Online in our dedicated space, we actually allow our customers to ship us databases. There's one big caveat here is that you need to make sure that your source environment and your target environment are exactly the same version. Or, well, actually, your target environment may be newer than your source environment, but you can't go back in time, right? So if your source environment is, let's say, on February 2012 CU, and your target environment is on an older CU, you can't move the databases because those databases they have the version stamp in it. Yes?
Recently I tried to do this from the RTM foundation presentation to an enterprise implementation. And they said it needs to be the same version.
So you're moving from an RTM version of the foundation into Portal. It should work. It should work that way, but not the other way around. So, but yeah. So then probably in your environment, so if your target environment had SP1, you might run into issues. So then, do you know which CU fixed that? Or is it still unfixed?
I think the issue is it comes down to what are the different versions that you get to. So it comes
Yeah.
down to which ones are actually supported on the upgrade tab.
Yeah, so what basically, so there's a mapping of from which version are you allowed to move to what version. So probably in your case, what you should do is then for your source environment, just patch that to, let's say, a newer version, and then you should be able to move that. So moving from foundation to enterprise shouldn't matter, but it's the RTM version and then the target version. So you may need to do an install SP1 on your source environment so that you can then move the environment. Sorry? Plus the appropriate CU, right? Now, yeah, and so I often get the question on like cumulative updates and not just for migration, but in general, which one should you use? So I think Spence mentioned it yesterday that like, will you always deploy the latest CU? You shouldn't, unless there's a business case for doing that, unless it fixes something that you need to have fixed. So, and because it's really painful to go back from a busted up CU installation. So. So another way, so again, the benefit of the database approach is actually you get all the site collections from that database. But if you want to be more granular, so what you could do is use PowerShell or stsadm to export a site collection, and then you'll get a backup file or a number of backup files that you can then take to another web application or to another site in the same web application and just import them. So how many of you have used PowerShell's export-import functionalities? Some of you? Cool. So again, it actually, the main target for this is, since it uses the content deployment, is actually structure and content. So you'll get identical copies in the same, that you'll get the same lists, you get the same libraries, you'll get the same items within those. What it does not retain are item IDs, alerts, workflow states, or the recycle bin information. Again, should it retain the recycle bin? I actually had a friend in the office who never put anything in his bin by his desk, so he kept that for storing important paper. So because like he knew that he would never put anything there that should be so, and the cleaning staff knew that they shouldn't touch his recycle. So, but then we switched a company that does actually clean up in the office. So he had his blueprints for his new house, and then he came in the morning and his bin was emptied. So like, oh my God! So luckily he found that. So, but it was he said that it wasn't the most pleasurable experience to dig through a week's of garbage to find your blueprints again. So recycle bin information, don't store vital things in your recycle bin. If you use export import, you will see that the export is typically much faster than import, and this is because the export talks directly to the database, whilst the import actually goes via the object model when it does imports. So let me actually show you a quick demo on how to do that. So here I have just a normal SharePoint site collection with data, some simple branding related information. Notice that like the documents are created in March and whatnot. So if I wanted to take this database with, let's say, from my production environment to my test environment or vice versa, an easy way to do this would just be by using PowerShell. And what I could do is then, let me just take my, you would use a PowerShell commandlet called export sp web, which is kind of funny because I was expecting that it should have been export site, but anyway, because you actually take site collections with it. So you specify the name of your site collection, you specify how many, like what level of versioning history do you want to take? So do you want to take major versions and also, or major and minor versions? And also then you specify where that information goes. So And what will happen behind the scenes is that SharePoint will then initiate a content deployment job that actually will take this site collection and back that up into a number of files. So if I go to my file system, what I will see data. It'll just create for me a bunch of files with the extension of CMP. And actually, these files are just cab files. So if you wanted to actually look what these guys contain, you can just do rename, and then you could look at it, and you will see that it has a bunch of, so it actually takes all the artifacts from that site collection and just stores them into a long list of files. And again, it also has a manifest file that then, when SharePoint is importing them, it'll actually know that, well, file 0000, that should become like the announcements item A's attachment 3, for instance. So again, usually you don't need to ever look at this because SharePoint just takes care. So one thing that's really important if you're using content deployment is that, so now I had taken a full copy of my site collection. If I wanted to import that, I can do that as well. But I need to create the site collection placeholder into which I import. So what I need to do is create a new site collection, and again, I specify the URL, who owns it, the email address. But what I don't specify is the template. So usually when you specify site collection using PowerShell, you have the dash template, and then you specify the site definition name. When you're using export import, you must not use that, because otherwise your import will fail, because it has the export package will actually contain all the template information SharePoint needs. So again, it creates an empty site for me, and if I go to my browser and navigate to this site, I would get, before I've run the import, I would get this because it didn't have a template assigned to it. So then the next thing is the final part, which is then again, you specify the same URL, and then you specify where the first cab file is. So if you have a really large site collection, the way that export will do is actually it'll create a number of cab files for you. So, and they will be divided in SharePoint. Actually, it creates files no larger than like 40 megs. So you'll actually have, if you have a large site collection, you'll get a big number of cab files. So I do this, and then what SharePoint will do, it'll take all the first cab file, and the cab file actually has a pointer to the next cab file. So it'll actually open up all of these cab files into a temporary directory on the SharePoint machine, and then it'll just start inserting those items into the site collection. So if I go, once this is finished, and again, if you have large site collections, this may actually take a long time. So when I've done some tests with site collections up to like 2, 3, 4, 5 gigs, it can take up to like 10, 15 minutes to restore those. Again, it very much depends on the performance of your environment. And what you will see is that if you use this, you're actually hammering the SQL server, because actually it does a lot of the things. So you'll see that the temp database really, and your transaction log sizes grow rapidly when you're using content deployment. Yes?
What effect does that have on site for the users? Is it going to recycle application pools?
No. Nope. It does not recycle applications, so there's no other impact than if your farm, let's say that if your farm is constrained on resources, then it'll be even more constrained, but there's no other impact. There's no application pool recycles required or anything like that. So it depends on how far along it has become, it's gone. So let me just take away this. So because the way that SharePoint processes those cab files, so the cab file has a file called a manifest.xml that actually lists all of those artifacts and where they should go, and it starts to process them from the top. So one of the first items is actually, it goes and applies the template, and then, so what you would see is that you might have an environment where you'll see that, well, this is empty, and then you refresh, you just start seeing content being added there. Yes? No. Yeah, unfortunately, you can't move. The content deployment packages are version specific. So there's actually an attribute in the manifest file that says which version it is. So that's one of the sort of limitations of this approach, is that it is version specific. You could tweak those things, but then you would enter uncharted, unsupported territory. So don't do that. Yes?
I'm not sure if you mentioned it before. It's not brought across the correct modified date and recreated files. Has it brought across any version history of the files? They all appear in the file.
It should have done that. No, they were created in March, so it should have. Good catch. I probably had the wrong flags when I exported it. But anyway, trust me, it works. Right? Yes, yeah. So you can specify with version history, like you can specify, do I want to keep just the major versions, or do I want to major and minor versions? And so at the import, yes. Sorry. So what I should have specified is this one. Then it would have actually taken the. So let me actually run that again. Yeah. I wouldn't believe myself. So. It should be pretty quick, so anyway. And there's other flags that you can, if you have solutions, so that it'll actually go, and if you have things in the solution gallery, it would go and activate those things. So let me just run. Okay. Anyway, trust me, it works. So I think it's just like, anyway, let me get back to that after. So, and the reason why, so it does retain those because, again, if you think of a scenario, so this was designed for the publishing scenario where you're taking content from a content creation environment into the final publication environment. So it actually does take those things. So another way to, I get electric shocks all the time. SharePoint doesn't like me. So you can also, another way of moving data across is obviously using backup and restore. So in a way, to me, that's more or less a similar approach that the export import does. The main difference here is that it uses different technologies. So again, a backup retains everything. Again, it is version dependent, so you can't take a backup of a 2007 environment and restore that into 2010 environment. The only way that you can do that is just by taking a SQL backup, and then when you're attaching a content database, SharePoint will actually try to upgrade that database. And it'll do the same thing for if you're creating the UPA and you're attaching the 2007 SSP user profile database, so it'll do the same upgrade process there as well. Some caveats: it is a long-running operation, and if you have people actually accessing that site collection whilst you're doing the backup, you may run into issues with corruption. So again, and also this is not for the really large site collection. So again, the backup operations, don't use it for sites larger than 15 gigs. Again, depending on the performance of your environment, it may work well for larger site collections. But again, what we've seen is that, again, use this for smaller site collections. But to be fair, with 2010 and now when we have the site collection recycle bin, actually you don't need this as much anymore as you did in the past. In the past, we usually had in our environment, we may have site collections that are more important than the others. So you had an alternative approach to backupping them, so having separate backups for individual site collections. But now with SP1 and the site collection recycle bin, you don't need that as much. So, moving to the more interesting part of the session. So moving non-SharePoint content. Again, there's plenty of tools out there. So there's tools, there's vendors who specialize on moving from WCM solutions. There's vendors that specialize on moving from Domino. Again, so there's plenty of tools. So the thing that you should, when you're sort of planning your tool strategy, the things that you should think about are, does your source environment have a different security model than your target environment? So if you have an environment that has, let's say, field level access control. So for instance, in Domino, you can create hierarchies that have actually really fine-grained security models. So again, you need to make sure that if that's an absolute business requirement, then SharePoint is not the right target. So again, figuring out, is your security based on a container level, meaning that you have, let's say, a list permission, or is it an item level, or do I have field level permissions? Again, in SharePoint, we can't do field level permissions. Also, the ACLs, what's your ACL model? So if you're moving, let's say, from a public folder, you usually, in public folders, you assign permissions to email users or distribution lists. And again, a distribution list is not a security principle in SharePoint. So if you're moving from one ACL model to another, you may need to do some conversion. So creating, for instance, if it's exchanged, then you would actually need to make sure that those distribution lists would be security groups as well. Another thing to look out for are like data hierarchies. Compound documents is, so email messages containing print screens or email messages containing attachments, because SharePoint doesn't do those things well. So if you have a file that contains files, how do you represent that in SharePoint? So should you move that into a list item with an attachment? Working with attachments is a pain. So if you want to do any collaboration on them, you probably would need to do, in 2010, you may want to consider actually moving a compound document into either into a folder, or you could use some of the new content types where you have actually grouping files into logical objects. Another challenge is if you have deep hierarchies. So in SharePoint, we have a limitation that the maximum URL length is 253 characters. So I did a migration for Kraft Foods Lotus Quick Place environment in Germany many years ago, and they had a really deep hierarchy. And the problem with that is, again, for Quick Place, it wasn't a problem because you never saw a full URL. You always had a URL that had an identifier, and that identifier pointed somewhere deep down in the hierarchy. In SharePoint, if you have a deep hierarchy, your URL will reflect that. So again, deep hierarchies, and also deep hierarchies are not very user-friendly in SharePoint. So because it's click, 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 click. So again, if you have those, you should actually consider flattening those hierarchies and then using metadata to achieve the same goal. Links, again, links may be challenged because you have links pointing to internal artifacts, so pointing within the same namespace that your source environment, or you may have links pointing to external things. So if you're doing a migration, the external links should remain as they are. You should only fix the internal ones. But then how do you know then? How do you analyze those? Metadata, you may have a document management system that has external repositories for metadata. So what's your migration plan then? So then for those cases, what I would recommend is you would then see if you could actually synchronize those external repositories with the managed metadata service application so that you could actually make sure that in SharePoint that you have the same thing in place. So again, the MMS has excellent APIs for doing this. Another challenging thing is if you have hierarchical metadata. So the only way of doing hierarchical metadata in SharePoint 2010 is using managed keywords where you can have those hierarchies. But other than that, if you have hierarchical metadata, you need to figure out how deep is the hierarchy and how will you sort of dissect them, say that the top level becomes column 1, the second level becomes column 2, and so on and so forth. And then how far do you want to go? Oh, I did that. So again, planning effort, file shares. Again, files are typically simple because it's just files. There's very seldom that you have links between files unless they're inside the document. Again, what I would strongly recommend is that don't ever go and modify files during a migration process because the liability issue that figuring out, so if something went wrong, how can you would you then need to go and assess all the documents that you used? So file shares, typically quite easy to do. So one approach could be to just point people saying, well, upload your own files. The problem with uploading your own files is the fact that you will lose valuable metadata like the original creation date, things like that. Medium effort for a file share, you may have blocked file types. So again, exe files, you may have large files like SQL databases and whatnot. You should have a remediation strategy for them. What's a sizable effort is if you're moving, for instance, from an NTFS file share and you have ACLs which has permissions and where you have inheritance, or where you have blocked permissions or deny permissions because we can't do deny in SharePoint. And the same thing if you have deep file hierarchies, they don't map well to SharePoint. Then public folders, again, where it's minor is if you have contact lists and things like that because they're just data. They're not applications as such. The ACLs I already mentioned. In Exchange, we assign access control items to email users, not necessarily to domain users. Where it becomes a sizable effort is actually doing the analysis of the public folders, trying to identify like which public folders are in use, who owns the public folders, and who has the sort of the permissions to say yay or nay that should a public folder move or not. The other things, embedded objects, so you have public folder where you're putting emails with, let's say, documents that have print screens. Because a print screen, you can't really easily represent that in HTML because the print screen picture is actually not a picture as such. It's a compound object. So that's one thing to look out for. And the compound documents, again, if you have an email with multiple attachments, where should you put that in SharePoint? Again, Domino can be anything. So what I've seen to be the best approach for Domino customers is actually only do the things that fall into the first two categories. If you have complex applications, my recommendation today is actually try to keep them on, try not to move them because, again, the feature sets, the functionalities aren't, there's no parity between a Domino environment and a SharePoint environment. There's parity on certain functionalities, but not, you can't just say a Domino application will work in SharePoint because in Domino you have replication, you have views where you can do macros, you have many ways of doing things. So again, my advice for Domino, target the low-hanging fruit, so the form-based applications, the template-based applications, the complex ones, I would actually say, well, what were the business requirements for this application? What are the business requirements today? And design a new application on that actually with the constraints of the new environment, and then just move the relevant data. Don't move the application logic, just move the data that you need. Because those are usually a really long-running operation. So for many of our customers who move to SharePoint Online, one of their drivers have been get rid of the domino environments, and those have always been like multi-year projects, and they realize that they can do this thing. They actually can get rid of a bunch of the licenses, and they actually just need licenses for those people who are using the complex applications. So they're not getting the full cost saving, but they are actually getting enough saving actually to make it worthwhile. So then, how should you choose what to do? So a self-service migration is actually the cheapest one. You just tell the user, so if you want to move data, this is your old environment, just move it to the new environment. So the benefit of that approach is also that people will move the data that they need. They will probably not move unnecessary data because it's painful and it's time consuming for them to do that. The problem here is that you actually don't always know what data you will need. So we had a Nordic bank for whom we did an assessment, and we actually defined that, well, we'll only move applications or sites that have more than 5 users. Because we said, like our decision criteria was that if it has less users, it's not that important. So luckily we had someone to sort of manually and went through all of those containers and figured and said, well, actually we have to move this. And then we said, why? Because we agreed that if there's less than 5 people, we shouldn't move them, and there's only 3 people using this application. Well, but those 3 people are CXOs. So it's kind of Orwellian, so all people are alike, but some are more alike than others. So again, all people are equal, but some are more equal than others, right? So, and also, when you do those criteria, so figuring out who the users are is a key thing, and also another way to say that if an application hasn't been used in the last 6 months, we shouldn't. Well, there are applications or there are data repositories that you only use once a year when you're doing the corporate taxes, for instance. So again, making sure that you know all those things. So the self-service approach, or then a tool-based migration, so which will be a combination of a manual process plus using tools. If you have complex migration using complex code, make sure that you have experts involved, so people who've done that in the past, because those ones are the ones where consulting companies go. Yes. Because again, those are the long-running, those are the complex ones, those are the ones where you really need to know what you're doing. So if you look at the tools out there, again, there's many vendors, there's people who specialize in different things. We have a bunch of vendors here who create excellent migration tools. So my advice is that there's no one tool to rule them all. So all the tools have their different strengths and their different weaknesses. So the things that you should look for is, what are the feature sets? So if your primary goal is to move data from, let's say, Domino to SharePoint, well, you should work with a vendor who specializes in that. The other thing is that you need to look out for supportability so that those vendors aren't doing anything that would put your environment in an unsupported state. The server footprint, so do I need to install anything on the server itself, or can I run everything remotely? What's the licensing cost? So we were doing an Exchange public folder migration for AT&T like 10 years ago, and we actually, one of the tools that we were looking for had a licensing model that were per user, not of the tool, but in the organization. And then the licensing cost for the tool alone was over $1 million. So the consulting work was like $200,000 and the license cost was $1 million. Again, so look out for that thing. And then the final things, so are you getting the tool, or is it a package where you have to buy the tool and consulting from the company who's creating that tool? Again, different vendors, different skills. So some of them are better in one area, some of them are better in other areas. So again, make sure that you're using the right tool and make sure that actually you know these things, because these things might be the hidden things that you then suddenly actually bumps up your migration project costs hugely. I'm kind of pimping my own tools, but there's some community-based tools out there that you can use to move data into on-premises environments again. And again, to me, you should use the same sort of a process, the same decision criteria. So, like, if you're using a community-based approach, if you're using a tool that you've created yourself, just make sure that if the tool meets your requirements, if it actually works for you. Like, I have no strong opinions on like using this tool or using the other tools. And then the problem with community-based tools, which I know better than many people because I'm actually managing this environment, is actually figuring out the support model. Because the good thing with a commercial tool is that you have someone who you can call and someone's neck to choke. So with a community-based, it's hard to choke a community. Well, but now you know that this is me. Oh, shit. So anyway, so again, the key thing is at the end of the day is actually when you're doing a migration is actually looking at remembering planning. Again, don't just blindly say that we'll move everything. Planning, making sure that you get rid of those T-shirts that's shrunken in the closet, get rid of those old cassette tapes so that you don't move data unless you really need it. And a good way of achieving this second goal is actually by putting a price tag to content. So when you're doing a content assessment, you should identify which are all the content sources that we're moving from and then assigning a cost to them. So if this is important for business, they should be prepared to pay for it. If they're not prepared to pay for it, I guess it's not that important, right? So with that, I think we are a bit... I don't see the clock over there, so that's why I don't know how much over we are. But again, there's nothing. We can actually continue until next morning because the next session is at 9 in the morning. So I think we can have the room until that. But I guess you'd probably rather go to the party. So with that, if there's any questions, I'll be up here. And if not, I'll see you at the party. Thanks.